I have 136 sightings out of Miller County, just that one county. And it is a great habitat. I mean, the Mercer Bayou is there, and rivers are converging there. And there's a lot of wilderness, and it's a great habitat. But I think there's so many in that area is because this movie gave them freedom to talk about it. And so there's more people talking about it down there. I bet that instead of 16, there are probably 75 in this county if people would just talk about it. Yeah, so I would encourage that. When I was in high school, I had in my English class, I had to write a paper, and I decided to write it on Bigfoot. And I had to have 3 people that I interviewed. And so I wound up calling Smokey Crabtree, that's in that movie, and he had a little guy, squeaky voice, and he interviewed me for about an hour, and I was so grateful for that. And he said, if you ever have a chance, come down here and I'll show you where all this stuff happened. And so spring break, I was geared up, and I was going to go do Bigfoot investigations. And I had a little pup tent and instant camera, and just like a kid would have. And I met Smokey down there, and he drove me all over the place and showed me all those things. And then I asked him, Mr. Crabtree, if you really wanted to see one of these things, where would you camp? And he said, well, if I wanted to see one of these things, I'd camp right there. And I'm sure he was just blowing, And so he pointed right there. And so I dropped him off and thanked him. And then I went and I set my camp up right there. And it was in Mercer Bayou. And I've never heard a night so loud as in Mercer Bayou. It was just deafening. And it sounded like everything was about to come and get me, and I was laying in my pup tent, and I had a knife in one hand, and I had a flashlight in another, and I was laying, but the scariest thing was when all of a sudden everything just got quiet, just dead quiet for 1 or 2 minutes, and you could just hear your heart beating. And then finally they would pick up again, and about 30 minutes later, just get real quiet. And finally, after a while, I said, nope, this Bigfoot research stuff is not for me. It's not for me. And so I left my tent, left everything right there, and I got in my pickup, and I drove, and I slept under the brightest light I could find in Falk that night. And went back to get my tent and all the next day, and I had a cooler about the size of that table there, and it was full of bologna and Cokes and stuff like that. And I couldn't find my cooler. It was gone. Now, if it was a raccoon, it would have knocked it over. A bear probably would have knocked it over. But I found it about 300 feet away from my camp, and it was sitting straight up. The lid was closed on it. But when I opened it, all of the food was gone except 3 canned Cokes that were in there. 3 canned Cokes, but all the food was gone, and I started looking around, and there were no wrappers anywhere, and the lid was closed. And was that a Bigfoot? Was he coming around? I don't know, but I decided, nope, that's not for me. That's not for me. And so I became an armchair squatcher. You know what that is?
Yeah.
You watch all the shows, you read the books, but you don't go out in the woods. And when my son was in the 2nd grade, we went on a father-son camp out below Helena in the wildlife refuge there. And we went to Alligator Lake. And I was disappointed because when we got to Alligator Lake, there was no alligator. But he was mad because there were no alligators, because he wanted to see alligators. But we were sleeping, and that night, for about an hour, he was asleep, and I was laying there, and I heard big rocks being clacked together. So loud it was just echo through the trees. And I said, what's making that noise? We had already driven around this area, this wildlife area, and there was nobody else there. In fact, in 3 days, we only saw one person, and that was the game warden that drove through. And I was saying, what's making that noise? And then I thought, what could pick rocks up and strike them together? You got to have hands, you got to have thumbs, you got to have, you got to be able to do that. And so I didn't tell Jamie about it because I'm sure he would have got all wigged out about it. But we drove around the next morning, and there had been big piles from a dump truck dump of rocks about the size of cantaloupes. They were going to fix the river levee there with these big rocks. And I was thinking, look, there's some rocks. Never even thinking about stopping and looking for footprints. This was a father-son camp out and not a Bigfoot thing. And so I got to thinking about it later, and I decided to throw my hat back in the ring. And since then, we have been, we've gone a lot of different places, mainly in the central Arkansas area, but I've squatched in Missouri and Oklahoma and Texas and Louisiana and Tennessee and Mississippi and a lot of Washington State. And with my work as a missionary, in the real world, I'm a minister. So when I was doing a lot of missionary work, we would go to places and I would research to see if there was any Bigfoot activity there. And then I was able to research in different places around the world as well. But we found tons of footprints. Audio recordings is probably the easiest to get. You get yourself a little Sony recorder like this and just put a lanyard on it and just hang it up in a tree and let it record all night. Some of those recorders will go 60 hours. And if it's in the wintertime, a lot of times the batteries don't last. So I always take one of those hand warmers and put it on the recorder and put a rubber band around it, and it keeps the batteries warm and it'll go all night that way. But yeah,